Hello everyone, welcome to week 7 of the St. Joseph philosophy course. This week we're going to be taking what we've learned over the past 6 weeks and we're going to look at the arguments that prove that there is a God and that he exists. Once we've gone over these arguments, we are going to see how modern philosophy attacks these arguments, and through modern philosophy we have arrived at a world where atheism has become rampant. So to begin this class today, we're going to take a look at the very history of the arguments for belief in God through reason alone. Now the very origins of this come from sacred scripture. In the letter of St. Paul to the Romans, chapter 1, verses 19 through 20, it states, "Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, understood from what has been made, so that the people are without excuse." So we can clearly see in sacred scripture that the world and the way it was made clearly manifests that there is a God, and that it is unreasonable for man to look at the world and come to the conclusion that there is no God. When we look at the history of the theologians, we can even look at the fathers of the church. Saint Irenaeus talks about the atheists and how it is unreasonable for them to come to this conclusion that there is no God, for it is clearly manifest by our observance of nature. Later, St. Augustine would come along, and he would come with a more proper argument. He looks at the order of the world and everything around us, and comes up with this idea that in order for there to be order in the world, there must be some sort of divine intellect that imposes this order on everything around us. Finally, we had the medieval ages, and different medieval philosophers came up with arguments for the proofs of God. Some don't work as well as others, but the most famous would be the arguments from St. Thomas, known as his 5 arguments for the proof of the existence of God. These would be known throughout time, and man would still use these for modern theology. However, there would be some disregard for St. Thomas's writings. The rise of René Descartes, the founder of modern philosophy, would attack and seek to undermine the arguments for the proof of the existence of God. Ultimately, René Descartes did this through his new philosophy, his new metaphysics, which distorted our understanding and relation with the world we live in. This new metaphysics of René Descartes would become the foundation for a heresy known as modernism. This heresy was so dangerous, and when we look at the world, we can see a lot of our belief or lack of belief in modern society can be attributed to this new metaphysics from René Descartes, a philosophy he came across while he was dabbling in the occult. Now, as a reaction to this, one of the great popes, Pope St. Pius X, reacted to it with his address and papal encyclical against modernism, and even had an oath against modernism. In this oath, he declared, "I profess that God, the origin and end of all things, can be known with certainty by the natural light of reason from the created world." St. Pius X wanted to be clear to everyone that our knowledge of God is not just some sort of sentiment from within, but by looking at the world, it is clear and obvious that there must be a God. Now, the very science that looks into this ability to see God through nature is called natural theology. Now, as we looked in our chart from week 1, natural theology is concerned with studying God, but studying Him through nature. So just by looking out in nature, we can come to different truths and proofs about who God is and His various attributes. And we do this without divine revelation. The science of natural theology is helpful because it allows us to show the atheists and non-believers that there must be a God without appealing to divine revelation. So as we go over this, we're going to look at St. Thomas's 5 proofs for the existence of God. The first one we're going to start with is the proof from motion. Now this one is something most people are familiar with, at least roughly. It goes like this. All motion, all things that are in motion, are put in motion by something else. However, that thing that was put in motion was also put in motion by another thing in motion. The problem that we have is that there has to be a first thing putting on things in motion that was not itself in motion. It can't go back infinitely because there was nothing to start the chain of motions. Now, this argument ultimately comes from Aristotle, and a lot of people have this argument misunderstood. They think Aristotle is arguing that God was the first motion of all motion, and that's not quite true. Aristotle does not say that God has to be the first of all motion, but rather the first in a chain of motions. So Aristotle did not believe that the world was finite, like St. Thomas did. Rather, he believed that the universe was infinite. You could go back in time an infinite amount of times. Now, because of that, what does St. Aristotle mean by the first in a chain of causes? Let's say you have a bunch of gears and you're running a car. A gear moves another gear, moves another gear, moves another gear. Now, if you go to ask what is causing those gears to move, you can't say it can be reduced to an infinite series of gears. That would be absurd because the gear in and of itself doesn't have the power to cause motion. Eventually, it must be drawn back to some sort of motor or something that causes that motion in things that don't have the power to cause their own motion. Now, looking around the material world, we see all sorts of things going in and out of motion. We see things that are moving, passing their motion onto things that are not moving. Now, in any chain of motion, there must be an unmoved mover that causes motion in others. Or we could say it another way. It has the power to cause motion without itself being moved. Now, all material things require something to cause their motion. Thus, this being, this thing that is unmoved but causes motion in others must be something immaterial. Now, if we stop right here with this argument, we have something that's actually incomplete. There were actually some theologians such as Duns Scotus and Cajetan that criticized St. Thomas for this argument, because this unmoved mover, this immaterial being that causes motion, it could be God, or it could even be an angel. So to fully understand what this unmoved mover is, we need to dig a little deeper. So remember, the argument is that from motion, we can necessitate that a God exists through fully understanding motion. Now, if we look at the metaphysics of Aristotle, we see that something is fully known once we fully investigate its causes. So let's say you have a business, right? You have the person on the line, you have the foreman, and you have the CEO. Now, understanding why the person on the line is working can be explained through understanding the foreman, but really a full understanding of why he's doing what he's doing can only be understood through understanding the plan and the mind of the CEO of the business. We could say the guy on the line is a principal cause, the foreman is a remote cause, and the CEO is an even more distant remote cause. But he is still a cause, and he is still necessary for fully understanding why the man on the line does what he does. Now, the same is true when we examine motion. So once we've arrived at this angel that could be the immaterial unmoved mover, we have to take this argument a little deeper and say, well, what causes the angel to exist? Just like the CEO hires and keeps that foreman in his position, there must be a higher cause that keeps that angel in existence. Now, the angel is either exists on its own, or it exists because it was created by something else. Now, ultimately, when we trace this back, we will lead back to an unmoved mover, which would be God, that is not just an unmoved mover, but is also the cause of its own existence and causes other things to exist, like the angel. So this leads us into the second argument for the existence of God, and that is the argument from existence. And it builds upon the argument about the angel. Now, when we look at everything around us, we can see that things exist. And the things we see go into and out of existence. Now, everything that exists has to have a sufficient reason for its existence. It either exists through itself, through its own power, or through another. Let's think of a computer. You're going to run Microsoft Word. Now, that computer can either run Microsoft Word through itself. We could say get electricity from a battery, or it could do that through an outlet, through another. Now, a computer that has a battery is in a sense has its own power to run the computer. It has that kind of existence of that Microsoft Word through its own power. But if it's plugged into the wall, the moment you unplug it, it loses its ability to run that application or program. We can refer to this as contingency. Rather, contingency means that something is dependent on something else for its existence. In the case of a computer that's attaining its power from a wall outlet, it is in a sense contingent, because the moment you unplug the computer, the program completely ceases to exist. The same is true with existence for created things. Though everything was created and was brought into being, it can only remain in being when some sort of power is keeping it in being or keeping it in existence. Just like pulling the plug on the computer, the moment the cause of anything's existence disappears, then those things it's creating also, or keeping in existence, would also disappear instantly. Now, since we see that man comes into existence, we can say that he cannot be the cause of his own existence. The reason is because if you come into being, then it'd be possible for you to cause your own existence, because you would have to be causing yourself before you exist. and this is absurd. And this truth is true for any being that is created. Rather, the ultimate source of all creation, the ultimate source of existence, must be a being that always existed and that is the cause of his own existence. Or in other words, it does not rely on something else to keep it in existence. Now, this being we see that causes other things to exist and bring things into being must also be eternal. And the reason he has to be eternal and infinite is because this being has the ability to create something from nothing. And to do that requires infinite power, because there is an infinite gap between something and nothing. So we can see that there must be some sort of all-powerful being that is keeping all things into existence. But we haven't shown that he is intelligent, but we can. And that leads us to the next proof for the existence of God. So the next proof that we're going to cover is from the degrees of being. So remember we talked about the different forms. There's the form of a plant, form of a rock, form of a man, and there'd be even the form of an angel. Clearly some of these forms, some of these beings are higher than others. Now this form is something immaterial. You can't just smash things together to create a form. Rather, it must be created in an intellect. It must come from something intelligent. We can also say that this form must come from something that is either equal or greater than that form. Based on this principle, we can say that God must be at least equal or greater than all of creation. Just like an artist cannot create a piece of art that is greater or beyond his capabilities, so too, the all-powerful being that created all of creation cannot be lesser than those things which he creates, because one cannot give what one does not have. For these capacities and creative potentials must ultimately subsist within God. So through the degrees of being, we can see that God is at minimum the greatest of all being. And this does not give us a very precise, exact understanding of who God is and what he is, but it does give us knowledge of God. The next argument is from finality or purpose. And this is another way we really see and can prove that God must be intelligent. So when we look around the world, we see that things are ordered toward a certain end, toward a certain purpose. Let's take magnets, for example. That's one of the easiest things. Positive attracts negative and negative attracts positive. Two positives repel and two negatives repel. When you look at these forces, ultimately, why do positives attract negatives? And why do two positives repel and two negatives repel? The ultimate answer is because these are laws of nature. That's what the modern scientists will tell you. Because there's not an actual answer that can be mechanistically explained. Now, if there's a law of nature, another way of saying that is because God, in his brilliance, decided that that's the way things should be. That negatives should repel negatives and positives should repel positives. Now, negatives or positives could do multiple different things. A positive could be attracted to a positive, it could do nothing, or it could repel a positive. There are three different options. But what is stated is that positives ought to repel positives, and positives ought to be attracted toward negatives. When you have multiple choices and you say they ought to do one of these, that requires an intellect to choose. For without an intellect, you can have things simply be a certain way. But when one says something ought to do something, you now have a situation that requires an intellect. And from this, we can prove that this all-powerful being, the creator of all things, the unmoved mover, must also be intelligent. Now, modern philosophy has really damaged our ability to know these things, these proofs for the existence of God. Remember, René Descartes, when he started his modern philosophy, he was dabbling with the occult. Now, when we look at what is at the very core of this, it's our knowledge of the external world, and really our knowledge of forms. Let's go over the first argument. So the argument is basically through knowing motion, there must be a God. Now, how do we know motion? We have our senses, and we clearly see things around us changing. Now, in modern philosophy, the certainty that there are things around us that are changing is not really known. Now, how does modern philosophy work? Well, let's look at traditional philosophy first. Traditional philosophy is relatively simple. I see something out there. What I see is actually there. I see a dog, there's actually a dog. There's actually a car, there's actually a tree. Modern philosophy doubts everything. Everything is in question. Or in traditional philosophy or Catholic philosophy, when I see a dog, that form of dog is in my intellect. I take that, abstract that form out of the dog and put it into my intellect. However, modern philosophy questions whether what we see is really there. For modern philosophy claims the world around us is just chaos, particles bouncing around. There are no forms. Or if there are forms, we have no knowledge of knowing that they exist. We can't prove that forms actually exist in external objects. Therefore, to understand the world, we see this chaos and our mind makes up forms. We see a bunch of particles arranged a certain way, and we interpret that as a chair. And we interpret certain particles to be blue, a certain color. Certain sensations are interpreted a certain way. A person that looks like a human being is just a bunch of particles bouncing around. But our mind interprets it as a man. And that leads us a little bit further. This thing we understand to be motion, is there actually motion in the external world? Or do we just interpret what we see as motion? Now, once we have motion, we can necessitate that there must be a God. However, modern philosophy has brought into question whether or not there is actually motion, or is motion something we simply create in our mind. Next is the argument from existence. Now, this one is a little bit harder to get rid of with modern philosophy, though it is technically possible to have doubts about this argument successfully proving the existence of our God. And the reason is because modern philosophy questions whether anything outside of us actually exists. There is the idea that we could be sensing things outside of us, and that's how we're interpreting it. Or modern philosophy also questions, is this all a dream? Do we really know that anything outside of us actually exists? If nothing outside of us actually exists, and we're the only thing that exists, we don't even know if we have bodies. Could we just be a simple thing that eternally exists, where for all eternity, where nothing is created. And you can wind up in a world where you are the only thing that exists. There is no contingent being. And in a sense, you have made yourself God, because the whole world around you is created by your mind. Instead of God being the cause of everything around us, your mind and your creativity is the cause of everything we encounter. Next, we look at the degrees of being. Remember, you have the different forms, from the lowly rock to the fish, to man, to the angels, different types of things. But remember, modern philosophy, all these external things, it could just be chaos. And man simply interprets this chaos to understand it. So outside of us may simply be nothing, or it could be one type of thing moving around, and our senses trying to understand that type of dust or chaos moving around imposes a hierarchy on being, which may not actually exist. Next, we have the argument from finality. Now, finality is purpose, or the fact that things have a certain end and reason for their existence. Modern philosophy goes against this very strongly. There was a modern philosopher by the name of Hume. Now, if you remember in our past talks, we talked about how finality is related to the form, and that the agent cause that creates the things around us, when he creates it, he creates things for an end or a purpose. Now, if things don't consist of forms, there is nothing intrinsic that is keeping things acting consistently, then there's no reason for motion to behave the same way. Hume, who rejected forms, believed that there is no causality. Rather, causality is something we interpret out of things. But we cannot actually know that things will always act the same way. So Hume refused to believe that just because we always see water acting a certain way does not mean that in the future water will always act a certain way. And ultimately he believed this because in the traditional philosophy, it is the forms that gives them their consistency, their stasis, makes water act like water and gold act like gold. But in a world without forms, without finality, without things acting for their purpose, it's no longer necessary that even material objects always act a certain way. And because of that, Hume ended up in a world with no causality. A world where just because you throw a ball doesn't mean it's going to land and travel in a certain trajectory. This sounds ridiculous, but this is the result of modern philosophy. And once this purpose, the fact that things have ends, is questioned and assumed not to exist, your argument that God is intelligent by finality and purpose in things becomes unreasonable. Now, when we really look at these problems, all these problems of modern philosophy come from their understanding of metaphysics, the Cartesian understanding of metaphysics, and the rejection of forms, of objective forms in external objects. And this is why St. Pius X was insistent that Thomism is a remedy to modernism, not just St. Thomas's theology, but also his philosophy. It was Father Garrigou Lagrange, who, while the modernists were in the church and attacking her philosophy to undermine her sacred doctrines, Father Garrigou Lagrange worked to combat their philosophical errors for the sake of protecting the church's theology. Well, that's the end for week 7. This will be the last series in my talks. I will be heading to the order next week. I hope you enjoyed the talks. Have a nice day.